It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Book at Lunchtime for week 1 of Trinity Term 2023. Today we're discussing Sarah Mortimer's book, Reformation, Resistance and Reason of State, 1517 to 1625. My name is Wes Williams. I'm the director of Torch. I'm also, in my adjacent, as opposed to other life, an early modernist myself. So I'm especially excited about starting this term with a discussion of a set of early modern as well as very modern questions. For those of you who are new to Book at Lunchtime from Torch, this is one of our, well, it is indeed our longest standing flagship event. Book at Lunchtime has been here from the very beginning of Torch, and that's now for 10 years. We are celebrating Torch at 10 this term, and and across some events next term. Look out for them. Some of those events will be additional Book at Lunchtimes, not all of them on Wednesdays. So do keep looking at the Torch website if you're interested in this particular form of exchange. As I say, this is one of our longest standing flagship events, and we have film recordings of each of them going back to 2013. So Book at Lunchtime has a growing history and a valuable heritage. The podcasts and videos of all previous discussions are a popular feature of our website and the YouTube channel, and we've been privileged to feature an astounding variety of books and authors over the years. No pressure, current people. You're part of an exciting tradition. We have a range of wonderful books to be discussed across this term. One last time, do look on the website to see and indeed sign up to the newsletter if you haven't already. Today then, we're delighted to welcome Professor Sarah Mortimer from Christ Church here in Oxford to discuss, as I noted above, Reformation, Resistance and Reason of State. Also, as I also noted above, the focus in this book is on an area which is close to my own area of research and close to my heart. To help us navigate through this key period in history, what is sometimes called the early modern period, although that's obviously a point that's contested and perhaps might even be contested today, I don't know. Sarah is joined by two panelists who will be adding their own expertise to today's discussion. As always, I'll introduce the panelists, and the chair of the panel will then introduce our speaker. First of the panelists is Dr. Noah Millstone. He brings to our discussion his experience from the universities of Chicago, Stanford, Harvard, and more recently, and now I think, Birmingham. Noah is currently working on a book about people talking about books. I want to suggest he might call his book Book at Lunchtime. But what's interesting and why he shouldn't call it Book at Lunchtime is because he's talking a book about people talking about books which they have not read in early modern Europe. In other words, from around 1494 to 1720. Noah's taking the long view. I should also say, or signal the fact that Noah himself does read books. In fact, is such an avid reader of and speaker about books that he has to rush off by 2 p.m. to be on another panel just down the hall on Zoom, in which case they'll be talking about books that we won't be able to be part of. So it all kind of fits. Our chair today is Dr. Alexandra Guider. She's the John Walsh Fellow and Tutor in History and Associate Professor of History at Jesus College here at the University of Oxford. Alexandra will be chairing the panel today, and I'll hand over to her in just a second. Before that, I just want to reiterate what a pleasure it is to see so many of you here today. There will be time for discussion afterwards. The speakers won't speak for the whole hour. But in order to moderate both the speakers and that discussion, I'll hand over now to Alexandra. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wes. Sarah, as Wes has, I'm introducing Sarah, and it's a great privilege to do so. She is, as Wes has said, student and tutor at Christ Church and Associate Professor of History. And she's a widely published scholar of the political, religious and intellectual history of the early modern world. Sarah's first brilliant monograph, Reason and Religion in the English Revolution, concerned the challenge of Socinianism in the 17th century England. But the book we're discussing today, published last year, is a history of political thought on a much broader geographical and indeed intellectual canvas. So we're going to turn first to Sarah to talk to us a little bit about the book and to say some of the things that she thinks is most important about it.
First of all, just a brief thanks to Alex and Noah for being willing to come and share their thoughts here today. I don't want to talk for too long because I'm particularly interested to hear their thoughts and comments and questions from people and to make this a discussion. I thought I'd just say a little bit about about the aims of the book and what I sort of hope to achieve in it. So it's part of the series, The Oxford History of Political Thought. And when I was asked to do this, of course, that got me thinking, well, what was political thought in this period, this early modern period? And as I researched and thought about the book, the definition I came to was really the ways in which people at the time conceptualized their earthly communities. So how did they think about particular communities in time and space that had an earthly or this worldly purpose, kind of peace, stability, virtue, and so on. And it quickly became apparent that there was a lot of discussion about this in the 16th century. It's a growing topic of debate and discussion in printed texts in particular in the period. But also that when people were writing about political thought, they were rarely doing so on its own or as a kind of discrete issue. On the whole, when people thought about political communities, they were thinking about how they related to other kinds of communities or other kinds of values. So most broadly, they were thinking about how their local political community related to some wider structure, an empire often, or perhaps the entire kind of human race or the whole of Christendom. So we're thinking about their community in its geographical context. But they were often also thinking about the relationship between civil communities or political communities and communities for different kinds of purposes. Most obviously the church or religious communities, but sometimes also the household as well. So one of the things I really wanted to emphasize in the book was the extent to which thinking about politics was thinking about relationships and thinking about borderlines. So what is the political community, but how does it relate to other kinds of communities? And what's striking, I think, is that the people that are most concerned to think about a local political community, Castile, Holland, Scotland, wherever it might be, but also the people who are most concerned to see how that related to other kinds of communities, to the church, but also to empires as well. And that's one of the things I really wanted to emphasize, just to see political thought as a discrete and very important strand of intellectual endeavor in the early modern period, but to emphasize how we cannot treat it independently. We have to think about it alongside theology, ethics, and kind of imperial legal discussion as well. The other thing I wanted to think about with the book was, why do people care about their political communities, especially when they see them alongside other valuable communities like churches or households or families, whatever it might be? So what is it that gives a political community value for people? And the main answer here, I think, is like the way in which that community is embedded or seen to be embedded in a system of natural law. So I flagged up throughout the book a debate about the law of nature as a sort of a set of moral principles that underpinned this worldly interaction. And there's quite a lot in the book about how ideas of natural law that structure politics relate to divine law, to Christianity, but also to some extent to Sharia law and Islamic religion as well when we look further east. So how do we think about political communities as kind of grounded in natural law, and how does that structure their relationship to churches and so on? But also, how do we think about justice within those political communities? And I was struck as I was writing and researching it by how strong the theme of political justice was, especially towards the end of the 16th century. And often this takes its cue from Aristotle's Politics and that question of how do we distribute office and honour within a community? How do we think about the relationship between virtue and merit and wealth and office holding? And that seemed to me to become a real strand of political reflection by the time we were at the end of the 16th century, and something that really flows through to political thinking later in the early modern and also the modern period. So I wanted to say something about its roots. And finally, I wanted to make the book genuinely comparative. So to think about the ways in which these questions played out in different places across Europe. And it was helpful to me there that a lot of the discussion is a kind of shared conversation, often taking place in Latin. But I also wanted to look a little bit at the world beyond Europe, encouraged by the series brief and the series editor. So there is a chapter on Islamic empires, and I found that a really fascinating chapter to write, and obviously reliant on secondary literature. But it really got me thinking about what's distinctive about Europe and the ways in which the power of regional and kind of national political associations, as opposed to or distinct from empires, generates a kind of political thinking. And also the ways in which religious authority is institutionalized differently in Christendom and in the Islamic world, actually structures a kind of different relationship between civil and religious communities. So it was good, I think, to do that comparative element. I certainly learned a lot from it, and I hope that that might encourage further discussion. But the absolutely final thing I want to say is that it's lovely to be able to talk about the book in Oxford, because it really is a book that grew out of so many conversations with lots of people who are in this room. And that from my undergraduate classes, which have been amazing and which I've really enjoyed doing with Alex, to the graduates and colleagues, it's been great to be able to have a context in which to talk about this. And I hope its sort of interdisciplinarity reflects some of those conversations. So thank you to so many of you for that as well.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And can I invite Noah to give us his reflections?
Yes, so as Wes mentioned, I'm writing a book about people talking about books they haven't read, but today we'll take a brief break from that to talk about a book I have read, which is sort of outside my purview. I often preface these conversations by saying that I'm not a historian of political thought, and this has never driven home to me so much than by reading works that really are histories of political thought. So I come to this as an outsider in a certain ways. But I want to take my 7 minutes. I was told I had 7 minutes, so this is time to, well, not quite to the second, but to talk about what I think is going on in this book that's important for me, and what I think some of the questions that are spurred by reading it. So I want to sketch out what I think are a few very important interventions for me and the way I thought about the history of political thought that I came from this book. So first, Sarah insists throughout that the main story, or one of the main stories in the development of political thought in this period, are the productive tensions between the concepts of law, particularly the law of nature, and religion. So this is a conversation throughout. There was a period in the middle of the 20th century where it seemed to many that the early modern preoccupation with religion made the works that were written in those periods relatively useless or irrelevant for political theorists working today. I have somewhere an old student edition of Hobbes's Leviathan that consisted only of parts 1 and 2, and just left out the terrifyingly radical parts 3 and 4 of the Christian Commonwealth and on the Kingdom of Darkness, which of course people in the early modern period were obsessed with. So those weren't the important bits in the middle of the 20th century. And this tendency to see religion as sort of residuum rather than as a central and animating problem, I think persisted for a surprisingly long time. By orienting the book around these problems, I think Sarah has not only restored the importance of the religious to the political theory of the period, or emphasized that, but has also created a version of the history of political thought that can speak usefully to other subfields within early modern history itself, where of course religion and the problems of religious pluralism are very prominent themes. As Sarah rightly observes, the relationship between these concepts and these problems were quite vexed before the Reformation. And I know that the book title says that it begins in 1517, but I think in really important ways it begins quite a lot earlier than that. And I think an important intervention is the way it frames the chronology, beginning with a pre-Reformation context that is anything but organic and stable. I think there's a way to approach the early modern which says, well, before 1517, everything was fine. Everyone was fine. Everything was cool. Everything was groovy, and then things were displaced by the Reformation. And Sarah doesn't see it this way, produces a really important and I think quite innovative discussion of the way the conflicts of the pre-Reformation era, the crises over conciliarism and the revival of Aristotelianism, producing quite different reactions in different parts of Europe. And I think actually that this can be pushed farther and will be pushed farther in the future, and thinking about the way in which these debates were in some ways preconditions for or conditioned the transformations of the Reformation itself. A third important intervention, which Sarah mentioned, but I want to pick up on some more, are these attempts to think about these problems in comparative but also outside of a metropolitan European context. This happens both in her emphasis on extra-European empire and in her sustained discussion of political thought and legitimacy in the Ottoman Empire and in Persia. I'm not a specialist in Ottoman history. It's one of the many things I'm not a specialist in. But I've spoken to people who do work in that field, who are delighted by Sarah's interest in the field and generally think the project of looking at the forms of thought and legitimacy more broadly across the early modern world. So that project, I think, has a very promising future. A truly global history of political thought could be a very important part of a global approach to early modern state and empire in which European developments continue to play an important part rather than being sort of completely marginalized. So I think that's an important step in those directions. And there are also, chances to do more with that in the future and using the incredibly rich sources from places like China. One of the things we can also say is that, like, as Sarah herself notes, a lot of the political thinkers she writes about were themselves deeply interested in the structure or what they knew about the structure of non-European societies. So I'm thinking about the humanist Justus Lipsius, who bases a lot of his analysis not only on his reading of Roman law, which is Roman history, very important, but also on the reports pouring in from imperial, mercantile, and missionary activities in Egypt and the Levant and Persia and in Japan. Giovanni Botero was positively obsessed with extra-European empires, and particularly China, which he saw as almost an ideal society. And so this is an early modern preoccupation, which I think is reflected in the book. It's difficult to overstate. So it covers a lot of ground, comparatively, geographically, and chronologically. And it's really difficult to overstate the usefulness of these sorts of books. They're, of course, immensely useful in teaching and helping students contextualize the sorts of complex primary sources that many are distressingly ill-equipped to confront. We've been experimenting with requiring all first-year history undergraduates at Birmingham to read a piece of Giovanni Botero. And so I'm grateful to have material that is able to give them, that I can give them, that explains Botero, who he is, what he's doing. Otherwise, I have to do it, and I hate doing it. They're also very useful in scholarship. All of us work in our own topics, on our own writer, and figuring out where they fit in, where their ideas fit in the larger scope of the period turns out to be terrifyingly difficult. This is a problem of chronology, but also of geography and discipline. Early modern Europeans, as Sarah noted, worked in a variety of disciplines in which we have, if we're lucky, at best partial command. Civil law, scholastic theology, and so on. I know a little bit about this stuff, but not enough. So actually confronting, and they're confronting a series of transnational interlocutors that they are often frustratingly reluctant to name. They don't say who they're responding to. I hate that. It takes an enormous amount of effort and mastery to be able to track the structures of influence, of call and response, of silent borrowing and silent refutation across multiple national traditions and through a long stretch of time. So I'm grateful that it exists. Naturally, I also have questions, which are to an extent about the limits of the project. Sarah uses lots of different kinds of sources that come from what early modern people would have identified as different disciplines. And she says, well, some they're doing theology, they're doing different things, and they come to talk about politics. And so she's thinking about law and theology, also pamphlets, and towards the end of her period, what she calls the emergence of the science of politics. And this is one of the points that I found most persuasive about the work. So I was one of these people who thought there's no political science qua political science in the early modern period, and I was completely wrong about that. Sarah's right. And there are, of course, no professorial chairs of politics or political thought in the period. I think that's true. I'm not. But to what extent does politics actually constitute or represent a field? Or when does it come to represent or constitute a field? And what is the shape of that field? Who are the audience for the publications of the material for these sorts of works? So Sarah described her sense of what the implicit definition of political thought she was working with was about community, and I see that. But I also think that she's working with, particularly interested in what she calls sometimes the normative structure of politics. So the structures of authority and right, and that she was particularly interested in those moments that are genuinely, generally a bit speculative rather than philological or empirical. So I think while Sarah has definitely persuaded me that this form of thinking about politics was important during the period, I struggled a bit to understand, and I would like her to explain to me, the relationship of this form of political thinking to other forms, contemporary forms of thinking about politics that were available at the time. So what, for example, is the relationship between the mostly abstract and academic works that Sarah talks about and the actual work of proposals, counter-proposals, projects, and decision-making that happened within governments? Right? These are not necessarily the same thing. They might not, or they might be. I mean, they have, to me, they look like they have different profiles. And most importantly for me, where is history? No one could argue, and indeed both Alex and I have both argued, that when early modern people set out to learn about politics, one of the first ports of call for them, so when early modern students were like, I want to learn about politics, their teachers would often point them not to, or they would often point them to Aristotle, and they'd often point them to the law, but they would also often point them to the relatively concrete representations of politics embedded in or created by historical narration. Sarah talks about these, she definitely does, but tries to use them. Her interest is to use them, or at least I read her interest is using them to work backwards towards the normative frameworks that were implicitly proposed in those works. But I'm not sure I think that that's how early modern people read them. I think that they were less interested in the normative than Sarah is. I think they were also interested in things about the concrete, but I'm not sure about that. But so I'd like to propose that as a question. But I'm extra delighted to hear about it.
Thanks very much, Noah. So I'm just going to pour myself some water. So Sarah and I have this marvellous special subject that we set up together, and it's been one of the great joys of working and teaching, I think, in my career at Oxford, has been to have this paper where we've had such great collaboration, wonderful students, and therefore I'd seen parts of this book at various points throughout the years that we've taught together, which are quite a lot now. But when I saw the finished book, I was really just struck by the magnitude of scholarship that is involved in this text. The sheer number of works she interrogates in so many different languages, and the extraordinary clarity with which she explains ideas that are very complicated, always very, very clearly for her audience. And she does all of this. Noah was talking about the utility of this book for teaching. It will be the go-to book on political thought of the period for anybody. But she does this at the same time as advancing quite new perspectives on the period's political thought. Now, I really hate academic controversies that are waspish. You know, it's kind of, let's have a historical debate. I mean, it's just not my way of operating. And therefore, I'm also very impressed with the way in which Sarah engages with the secondary literature, but does so in a manner that is not even slightly polemical, or not obviously so. And when she refines and contradicts the interpretation of other scholars, it's purely, I think, through the strength of her analysis. So in my first observation or question for Sarah, I'm going to do something rather perverse, having said all that. I would like to know a little bit of how you see your work in relation to the classic works of Francis Oakley, Quentin Skinner, Annabel Brett, and just to perhaps clarify for the audience here, what is really new about this book, because there's plenty that is new within the work, so much. And my second set of observations really relate to the relationship of what you have to say about political thinking and political thought to the various subfields that Noah gestured to just now. This is a work that quite often, that for a lot of the book, tries to a certain extent or has to divide the political thought of Catholics from that of the thought that emerges from the Protestant Reformation, particularly in the earlier part of the 16th century. And especially around the way that theologians and divines conceptualise the relationship of divine law, natural law, and positive laws made by human societies. And I think you really brilliantly plot the way in which the confessional schisms of Europe required clergy and theologians on both sides of this Reformation divide to rethink their understanding of the relationship of the civil community and the church. These are, of course, paths which talk profoundly different directions, depending on whether or not you're writing within the structure of papal authority or vehemently outside of it. As well as thinking about confessional divisions, I wondered then if you could say something more about other categories we could impose on the manner in which men, and it is exclusively men, it has to be, wrote and thought about political thought. I think this is also connecting to some of the things Noah's thinking about too. Would a history of political thought that contrasted lay writers with those of the clergy produce insights? Would it be worth doing? One that studied different groups of lawyers, and in particular people thinking inside and outside of educational institutions such as universities. I wondered if perhaps Sarah could reflect on thinking about different sorts of categories of how one might write or how future histories of political thought might be structured. And following on from that, I also wonder, I think you've almost answered this really in your introductory remarks, about what you think about the current, well, not current, over the past 20 or 30 years or so, the expansion of the concept of the political more widely for scholars of our period, especially by social historians. Now, we're both great admirers of Noah Dauber's work, which really seeks to bring together social and intellectual history. And in your book, you rightly note that early modern men and women were members of a great number of overlapping communities. They were members of villages and parishes, commercial organisations like trading companies, families and kinship networks, and of course, educational institutions. Now, all of these communities or organisations possessed structures of authority and governance. And the ends of this authority and governance tended to be peace, welfare and happiness. The same ends, I think, we'd argue, that characterise the purpose of the civitas for Aristotle and the state for so many of the authors that star in your monograph. So I suppose I want to ask, would you argue, as the social historians often do, that the debates that emerge in a village council are a species of political thinking? Or does politics only exist at the level of national political communities in relation to the organisation of state power? And you have also gestured to how you've defined political communities within a particular relationship to natural law. And again, relating to that final point, my final kind of observation is the way in which, sort of rippling under your discussion of different texts, it is another kind of story that comes out of our period, which isn't what's related to Reformation and Counter-Reformation, but it's also related to the changing nature of the state itself during our period. And in particular, the expanding scope of state power. State power, I mean the material manner in which governments are seeking to extract greater resources from their subjects in the form of taxation or through conscription into armies. And also the notion of the kind of confessional state, which saw temporal authorities, particularly Protestant ones, but emperors, kings and republican governments create laws and institutions that intrude even more extensively over the lives of subjects, ones that regulated sexual conduct, dress, commercial practice, and all other sorts of aspects of daily life. So I suppose I wanted to think about how your understanding of the processes of political thinking related to those those questions of the power of the state and its expansion. But I thank you very much, though, Sarah, for writing what is already, I think, a classic text. And I think we now invite you to respond to our comments.
Great. Well, thank you both for your comments, and thank you for kind of reading it, engaging it, and it's great to hear that it's at least useful to people. So that's wonderful. Maybe I'll just start very briefly, perhaps, with Alex's question, which I always find a little bit difficult to answer, which is really to articulate kind of what's new about the book, because I think that might also help explain some of the decisions that I made about the things to include and to exclude, because as you both mentioned, there's quite a lot of stuff in there. I managed to keep it within the word limit, but obviously there's loads of more stuff that one could include. And part of the selection process, or thinking about the story that runs through it, was in part thinking, well, what are the things that I think maybe have been a little bit lost from our historical discussions and perhaps need to be just flagged up because they were really important at the time, and we need to keep them in mind. And I suppose, I mean, kind of obviously one of the things I really wanted to flag up that Noah's already mentioned was that politics is always seen, I think always seen in relation to theology in this period. Because if we think about what political thought is, it's about how to make a community work and about how to see that community, I think, also as valuable, as having some claim upon us, some reason for our allegiance and obedience. And in order to make that claim in the early modern period, you need to think about other claims that might be upon people, most obviously religion. And so I really wanted to say something about how people saw their civil community in contradistinction to churches and religious communities. And that's such a strong theme running through the period that it really needed to be flagged up. But the other two things that I wanted to do were to set that political thought more firmly in context than I think other histories of political thought have done, and in a genuinely historical story about change over time that takes time and space seriously. So although many histories of political thought do kind of mention the stuff that's going on, I would say that what's maybe a little bit distinctive about my book is that I did try and give you a pretty clear sense of the historical developments beyond the academy that were taking place, in terms not only of kind of political struggles, but also, and this is the kind of other thing I want to flag up, in terms of a kind of changing social and economic environment. So as my undergraduates who are here will know, I'm constantly going on about inflation in the early modern period. And that is clearly a massive challenge to rulers and elites alike. And the ways in which some of those social and economic changes get people thinking about questions of, broadly speaking, social mobility, questions about the state and the state's power, I think are really important. So I did want to fold those into the analysis as well. But of course, still, of course, one can't say everything. And the book is, I think, also distinctive in that it really is about political thought, maybe as I've learned to say it from talking to some people in political theory as well, but as kind of reflection on like the value of politics rather than the immediate decision making. And I guess I would distinguish it, the kind of history of political thought that I've told, from a history of political thinking and decision making in kind of practical circumstances. And that's really none of us can do everything, and that's really kind of what I focused on. And I hope that the book will be helpful to those people looking at political thinking, because it's not at all to devalue that, but it is also to say that I think that's slightly separate often from the conversation about political thought, even when it's informed by it. And it's often too in its own language, not only in terms of different vernaculars, but also different kind of ways of writing. That I'm just not really equipped to deal with. So I think political thinking is worth seeing as a kind of somewhat separate kind of genre. And I think that's true of history as well, maybe to a lesser extent, but I mean, I did wonder about including things like some of the historical writing that emerges in this period, but maybe it's designed in part for a slightly different end and also follows a slightly different kind of disciplinary structure. And so I would hope that in the future we could bring these things together. But the only way really to make the book manageable for me and for my reader was to kind of think about political thought in the way that I've defined it. But I tried to be fairly open in the introduction about that being the way I was defining it and not wishing to kind of exclude or I'm excluding, but hopefully not devaluing other ways of seeing it. Yeah, and I think that's probably also my answer to Alex's question about different kinds of categories, because though I took the confessional divide very seriously, not least because it's so often theologians who are writing about what is the civil community and being read by non-theologians as well. But I think that there clearly are other really important discussions going on in different places that are worth integrating into this. But having just come from teaching Aristotle and going back to teaching Aristotle, maybe I would advocate for a kind of distinctive quality of political thinking that perhaps makes it different from discussion in a household, possibly even discussion in a village. And that maybe comes to the sense of the civil community being a kind of self-contained community potentially, whereas we might be thinking about a village more obviously in relationship to the wider units of which it's part. Although I wouldn't want to kind of go to the line on that one, and that's just maybe my sense of it. Yeah.
Can I come in on that?
Yeah.
I think actually one of the really, because of the richness of the tradition of political thought that develops in the 16th century, certainly by the time I'm familiar with in the early 17th century, or the time I'm most familiar with in the early 17th century, people are using metaphors about the political community, sort of about the state level political community, as a way to think about the government of the self, which of course is an ancient pedigree from Plato, but also to think about the government of their Oxford colleges, where they talk about there being tyrants and all sorts of things. And so essentially, I think that the developments of the resources, the intellectual resources of political thought, as you're discussing them, become so rich that people then use those as metaphors for thinking about all sorts of communities that they're involved with, or even of their own self. So I think that there are ways to draw connections between those, and I think it's right to recognize the richness of the theorization that goes around the sort of proto-national states.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. I suppose it betrays, as I say, many years of teaching theories of the state, which I hadn't realised, I suppose, how much that teaching of Aristotle would both inform the early modern ways of thinking, but also inform my ways of thinking. It's been kind of interesting to reflect a little bit on that. And I think there's a kind of, clearly there are alternative ways of thinking about political thought that would sort of dial down on that.
Would you show you one other thing about the question about the decision makers? I mean, so I work on the decision makers more than I work on the theorists. I work on the theorists a little bit, but I mostly work on the decision makers. And one of the things that's happened as a result of that is that when I go look at the theorists, sometimes I feel like the theorists are responding to the forms of decision making that they see outside of their sort of academic circle. So some of these people are professors, they're not actually in government, but they're watching what's going on in government, and they're trying to come up with some response to it at the level of their analytic discourse. And so I think that it's necessary for us to bring these forms of sort of ideological production together, because the people who are producing them are also really interested in bringing them together. And I think that that's a project that we should be pushing forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that goes back to thinking that we really need the kind of historical story to be firmly there. And goes back to what you were saying maybe earlier. I mean, what I really want to do is situate these authors like quite directly in their time and place and think about the specific issues that they're responding to. So, I mean, for example, thinking about someone like Althusius in a particular kind of Nassau and Emden context, thinking about a particular set of problems and, you know, offering some reflection that's designed to go beyond them, but is clearly shaped by those circumstances and his own political experience. And absolutely, the more we can do to hold those together, even as perhaps we are aware of the generic differences, the richer a discussion we'll all have. Absolutely, yeah.
Did you have a sense, as you sat down to write the book, of what what your selection of texts would be? I mean, would you say this is a work of discovery in terms of, the cast of characters?
Kind of yes and no. I think it surprised me how much some authors came in. What did surprise me a bit was, again, what Noah picked up at the start, so when I was asked to write this thing, it was 1517 to 1620, and I argued them to 1625 so I could get Hugo Grotius in. And he was definitely in it from the start, right? Good old Hugo Grotius. But I had expected, I suppose, to start with Luther, and then I realised that was just impossible. And that it was really important to have 2 whole chapters, as well as the introduction, before you even get to Luther and the Reformation. and particularly something like the Council of Peace, the 1510s discussion of natural law was much more interesting than I'd expected.
That's a really wonderful, I mean,
yeah.
There were many wonderful moments, but that was very revelatory to me when I read that.
It's fascinating, yeah.
I think it might be time for me to take questions from the audience.
Sure, so defining political thought obviously is a bit of a kind of iterative process. So I think when I started writing the book, it was reasonably clear to me that I had to come up with some definition of political thought that was going to make the project manageable, and it was going to therefore really be about politics rather than ethics or whatever. But I'm not sure I'd fully conceptualised that until I started really reading quite a lot of these texts and noticing just how often there is explicit reflection on what it is that makes a civil community, the kinds of structures it needs in order to kind of operate, and how it might be different from other kinds of communities. And so I guess that's why I ended up using that as I was going through. And I think in the early modern period, that sense that a political community is a distinct kind of community does come out of the revival of Aristotle's politics, especially as we get into discussions of political science by the second half of this period. That Aristotle is kind of fairly clear that households and villages don't include sort of full political relationships. They're not spaces for political discussion. And that feeds into a discussion in the Holy Roman Empire in particular about what kind of community, the kind of levels of community. So how you might have citizens who are engaged in genuinely political activity in a German city like Hesse or a state like Marburg, and then that might be the context within which political activity can take place. Designed, I think, in part, it comes back to this kind of political decision-making issue, that we're getting these more powerful local political communities, which are, see themselves as very different from households and villages, but they're not the imperial centre. But they think that there's something, that they can make a claim on people's allegiance in a way that ties of aristocratic lineage can't. So there is a real desire, I think, to bolster this level of the political, particularly in these, particularly I think in the cities of Germany, and also if you think about somewhere like France, a desire to say, look, you need to be loyal to France rather than to the House of Bourbon or to the House of Guise, to La Rochelle, whatever it might be. So there's a desire to construct these political communities that kind of feeds off thinking about Aristotle. And starts to do that. And then secondly, of course, because there's so much discussion that says, okay, here is what a civil authority can do, and here is what a church can do. And to think about the civil community in contradistinction to ecclesiastical authority. And that's just such a strong theme that I think it also similarly does help to shape what politics means for people in this period. So I don't know if either of you two,
Just going to comment on that is that actually that's a real theme in particular of the Catholic political thinking, the scholastic thinking, but obviously it's the reverse if you're thinking about Reformed theology, which sees the minister and the magistrate as having the same kind of role, but with different parts, and that sees the civil community as existing to enact God's law. And I thought that was a kind of central kind of theme of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose also a way in which that becomes so problematic that actually the Protestants just take over so much of the Catholic way of thinking.
Exactly. Yeah, that mid-century bit is, sorry.
Absolutely.
I think there's also some variation over time. I think that there's an overplace. I think people are playing with the level at which this is true. If you think about the development and the revival of Aristotelianism in Italian city-states, the Italian city-states didn't have a political community. They were asserting that they were a political community and that they existed in an imperial context or a papal context in which they were a political community. I found once a sort of mirror for magistrates, an Aristotelian mirror for magistrates that was directed to the aldermen of the town of Grantham. Lincolnshire. It was about the Aristotelian political community of Grantham. And so I think that, you can play with, I think trying to understand and imagine what is the level at which these ideas and principles and histories of thinking are important is part of what they're doing throughout the period.
Yeah, and like you say, there's often a strong polemical edge to it, isn't there? This is about creation as much as description, or more than description, of community. It's true, isn't it, that a lot of this political thought is written by people who are, if not losing, then certainly not at the centre of power. So often it has that purpose of trying to reshape the political community. And I think the rhetoric through which this is done is really, really interesting. And I guess I try to kind of at least say something about it in the book, because there are quite distinct ways of doing this. And one way, of course, is to use the sort of the generic norms of the university, the kind of scholastic political thinking that you might get, which can be very clear and very persuasive through its clarity. But in a sense, as states need more resources, need to draw more people in, as the pamphlet literature becomes more complicated or more extensive, there is, I think, an increasing appeal to imagination, to rhetoric, to the kind of persuasion that might attract people who aren't used to those generic conventions. And I think that is really important. And a book like mine can't really do justice to it. But I do talk a little bit about people like Sidney and Spencer, and the ways in which they use fiction to imagine political communities that they wish to see enacted in England or in Ireland and beyond. And I think that's definitely an important part of political thought that it would be a shame to lose. I mean, Alex, you probably have more to say on this than I do, but yeah.
I think it's interesting you turn to Sidney and Spencer for those examples, because Elizabethan England is, as we've discussed very recently, a place where people don't really write formal normative political thought of the type that you study in the book, but you do get interesting political ideas through the period's literature for various reasons relating to the political condition of England at the time. Yeah, but I think there was a question from Antonio, and then perhaps one here as well.
So there's kind of, a historiographical point here, I suppose, which is that, Constance Skinner sort of famously suggested that because Protestants and Catholics are both appealing to natural law, that it wasn't a confessionalized concept. And one of the things I've never found that very persuasive, and in the book I was trying to kind of figure out quite why. So one of the claims I do want to make is that they understand natural law differently, at least for part of this period, and at least in the main. I mean, there are clearly outliers on kind of all sides. So, and that's to do with how Catholics understand the authority of the church and its relationship to natural law. So I want to argue that we need to take confessional difference seriously. But I also wanted to suggest that there are, these texts, of course, are because so many of them are in Latin, they're available to a scholarly elite across Europe. And they are clearly reading and responding to each other. And so clearly at universities, there's a lot of reading of people from the other confessions, like partly to see where they're wrong, but also because you think often they're kind of right. And as kind of I flagged up a little bit earlier, I think there is a strong sense in which by the early 17th century, Protestants in particular are taking up some of the ways the Catholics thought about natural law earlier, but obviously I think Grotius is the clear example of this, but adapting it to their own purposes. But I also want to kind of argue that within that broad cross-confessional and confessionalized discussion, it really depends on where you are in a particular time and place. And to say that, take someone like Suarez, so we should see him absolutely as a Jesuit, a Catholic writer who has kind of Catholic ideas about natural law and so on. But he's writing in Portugal, which has, been taken over by the Habsburgs. Relatively recently, he's quite interested in what it is that holds the Portuguese community together. And that makes him different from someone like Novaris, who's writing in a land that's been taken over in a different kind of way, or different from someone writing in Castile. So even within the same sort of Habsburg Iberian Peninsula. So I think there are these broad principles that run across a lot of European debate, but I'm struck by how differently they can play out in different times and places, and want to flag up that diversity.
Well, there's a fundamental asymmetry because especially by the end of the 16th century, Catholics are not allowing just any university student who wants to read Protestant political works. So the high-level theologians that Sarah's mostly talking about, Bellarmine can read whatever he likes, but if you're just a student at Bologna, you're not going to be allowed to read Althusius in the same way. So I think there is a fundamental asymmetry about the availability of texts, which we're still working. I mean, I was just saying to Sarah the other week that Baudin's. We know the 6 books of the Republic were not just banned, but they had the Inquisition insisted on issuing a special appendix to the Clementine Index of 1596 to emphasize that under no circumstances were anyone to read Baudin. And so it's there is a symmetry in the conversation, I think.
There is, and I think that's an intellectual asymmetry as well. I mean, I think that it's true that it's about availability, but I think it would be interesting to know how much they would take from them if they were allowed to read them. Yeah. The wonderful thing about political thought is it can go out in so many different directions, can't it? And I think that, so I've tended to use the word community because it can kind of capture quite a lot of the different things that people are talking about and kind of hold multiple conversations, I suppose, together into one book. And often what people are talking about is it's partly about what it is that is this community, but it's often and as much about what is the kind of power or the authority that organises it, or that has a claim upon the people within it. So my use of the term community is, I suppose, a way of capturing that sense of authority and power as well. In terms of the civitas in the household, so I guess I would say if I had turned the political science chapter into a book, I absolutely would have needed to cover all of these things in a lot of detail. And I would have said a lot more about the household, and it's a shame that I didn't. Thinking about some of the discussions in the earlier chapters, and especially some of the questions about resistance, and about the relationship between a civil and a religious community, I think the household is less important. I think there's less interest in thinking through the household, and this may be sometimes implicit, but also a kind of claim that, or desire perhaps, to see the civil and the religious as the loci of allegiance rather than the household or lineage or kind of noble blood, because that's so disruptive. And the people who are wanting to conceptualize authority in this way often want to get away, I think, from a world in which it's lineage in particular that's kind of giving political power. It's always hard to know, isn't it, how to read text, how, sincere, as it were, people are. And I think it's really important to see what their agenda is, and what it is that they're trying to do. And I suppose it is worth saying that, natural law is clearly being used by the Catholics to say, look, the political community might be good, but obviously the church is better. So there's a sense in which natural law has built into it, for the Catholics, a kind of sub-optimality, if that's a word one can use. So yeah, I think the reason why they're appealing to natural law, using natural law, is important. But I guess I've wanted to think about, what it is that these people are trying to do. And often it's, anything from like building up the power of the local city ruler in the Holy Roman Empire to the power of Philip II or Pope Pius IV. And just think a little bit about that, but still to kind of take seriously what it is that they're saying. I don't think we can ever know intention. All we can do is try and see how their words fit in with the kind of actions of the world around them, and to try and kind of think about it like that.
I think that may need to be our last question because we are losing one of our panellists who's going to slip off to another panel. So it remains to me to say thank you very, very much to Torch for putting on this wonderful event. Thank you for Sarah, first for writing a book so wonderful, and thank you for everybody for coming for what's been a really fascinating discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.